Thank you to everyone listening. In terms of the remark all over the alternative media, it's not my choice. Would have been very happy to have been interviewed by any mainstream TV, radio, newspaper, and I did write to phone all of them. But as you know, I hope you know, there was complete suppression of anyone's opinion other than the dominant narrative. Now, the reason I've been speaking out from the beginning was it was just blindingly obvious as early as April 2020 that we were being lied to, just literally absurd. And so those of you who might think, well, I'm a conspiracy theorist, I will say there is an international plan. There's nothing theoretical about it. For example, each country, scores of them, had their own pandemic preparedness plans. Of course they did. And they're all slightly different. And then they all threw them away about the same time. And then they all adopted what I call the 8 COVID lies. Now, if you've ever seen any of my interviews, you'll know what they are. And if you've even got an A level in biology, as my humanities graduate daughters say, you don't even need that. You just need common sense and not to be completely stupid. But your government's been lying to you for 15, 18 months. I'm sorry, they are. Now, why would I bother to speak out? I was an early retired guy who'd made quite a few millions of pounds because I was quite good at what I did. And I had a nice, happy, relaxed life. And I've made no friends and lost lots of my life over the last year. So the only reason I'm speaking out is to tell you what I just said, that you're being lied to, and there's a very bad reason for that. So anyway, to today, and unfortunately the vaccines are part of this very bad plan. I'm generally, of course, pro-vaccine, and the people who say I'm an anti-vaxxer are idiots. I've spent 32 years in the pharmaceutical industry, working to try and create new innovative medicine. So anyone who does that has my thumbs up, provided the medicines are safe and provided they're used appropriately. And these gene-based vaccines are neither. Very briefly, just to contrast and compare what you normally think of as a vaccine and with what you've got. A conventional vaccine does have all the character that I think you think of them as having, which is they're generally extremely safe. There are occasionally rare side effects, but I've had all of my shots, and so did my children and my grandchildren. So they generally provide immunity to whatever it is you've been vaccinated against. And what that does is the whole premise of vaccines, you arrive fit and well in a doctor's office, they give you a shot or an injection. You might have a little soreness for a day or so in your arm, and then you're protected for a long time, often for life, against that particular serious illness. And the way that's accomplished is to give you a dose of usually a killed version of whatever that disease-causing agent is, a bacterium or usually a virus, and along with something else just to wake your immune system up. That's the basis of a traditional vaccine. But these are not that at all, and not that at all. These are unique. They've never been used before on any scale for any kind of treatment in humans. And these all contain a piece of genetic code, either DNA with a virus to carry them into your body, or messenger RNA, which is the intermediate step between your genes and protein, which is the product. And those use just sort of basically a slippery coating of lipid nanoparticles to help them slide into your cells. So all very well, all very Star Trek so far, but there's at least 2 major problems. The major problem, number one, with these is they've used what's called the spike protein. So you'll have all seen this cartoon ball of the virus with all these knobs, these little bumps sticking out the surface. That's called the spike protein. And they came up with this bright idea that if we could encode those in these gene-based vaccines, then your body will manufacture some of that. How's that? You've taken over your body, so you temporarily become a manufacturer of virus proteins. You never thought you were doing that before, did you? But that's what you've been doing. And unfortunately, the spike protein is highly active biologically. It does lots of things. And when I point out, for example, it will cause your blood to clot wherever it is expressed sufficiently near your blood, then you probably should be worried, because that's exactly what it's doing. And I'll come back to that. But so that's one problem, that the antigen, the thing that has been encoded to ask your body to manufacture it, itself a unique process we've never done before. Unfortunately, they've picked something that is not benign. It is toxic. It's a biological toxin. But the other problem is, unlike conventional vaccines, when you get a fixed dose, let's call it 5 millismidgens of a dead virus, what you're getting now is 5 millismidgens of genetic code. But that means that Mike Eden might take that vaccine up very well, and I might make lots of copies of it. So I could end up with 250 millismidgens somewhere. You might take it up less well, and you might make less copies of it and get 5 millismidgens. Well, that's a huge range of outcomes. That's the problem. It's absolutely inevitable. Because these vaccines have multiple steps, which are not controllable, they're not even measured, but there will be differences between people. I think some people will make huge quantities of spike protein for a long time in bad places, and they get ill and maybe die. And other people make smaller quantities in more benign places, and they say, hey, no side effects. What are you complaining about, Eden? Well, I've just explained to you. It's built into the mechanism that there will be huge variability. I think that's a major problem. So that's the contrast between conventional vaccines, which are generally very safe and they work really well. And what they do is just present your body with a dead version of that which you would normally conquer. But now you don't have to have the disease. Your immune system, as it were, takes thousands of pictures of that dead thing and keeps a memory of it. So that's the convention. It generally, though, takes years to do that properly. Somewhere between 5 and 10 years would be conventional. And that's because you want to be able to, you don't even know what dose to use when you start. We do things called dose range finding studies. We didn't do that as far as I can tell, or if we did, it was all done at tremendous speed in not very many people. So they blazed away with Operation Warp Speed, I think it was. You do know that warps don't work. It's a Star Trek term. It doesn't really mean you can go fast. It's just literally absurd, isn't it? Operation Warp Speed. I mean, what happens is they just missed loads of steps out, and then they lied to you and said they hadn't missed the steps out. I'm sorry, after 32 years of drug development, I'm afraid you can't get, we say in Britain, you can't get a quart into a pint pot. You just can't. You go very quickly. There are some things you've not done. And some of the things I'm going to come on to that we've not done, I just think there's been a complete failure of the regulatory process. So with vaccines that are rather similar to the ones I just described, the sort of traditional ones, we know generally the kind of things you want to control for. We know what goes wrong, and therefore there's a whole set of sort of rules and requirements that will help you, help make sure that the vaccine does clear those hurdles. So when you finally get to use it, you can have confidence, which you should do. We've no idea what those steps should be for a gene-based vaccine. No idea. There are no medicines of this type in humans, in the mass population. No one knows what the right things are to do. And I would tell you, as I just described earlier, we don't know how they distribute in the body. We don't know for how long they make how much protein and in which bit of the body. That's called pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, and they've simply not been done. And as a biologist, I'm absolutely horrified. I would be terrified if someone says you have to have this, because I would know they've no idea where it's going to go. And so that's the situation. So we haven't done any of the studies, I would say, to characterize its safety, really. And another thing is, because they're not like normal vaccines, you can't make any assumptions that it'll be, say, safe in pregnancy, safe in just prior to becoming pregnant. No idea at all. And I think, and this is something you'll know is true when I tell you, with anything that's like a complex, novel experimental medicine, these definitely are all of those things. We never, ever give it to pregnant women. Never, not since thalidomide 60 years ago. And the reason we've never done it since thalidomide 60 years ago is because back in those days, there was just an inadvertent failure of regulation. We had no idea that babies were not safe inside their mother's wombs, but in fact, highly exposed to any kind of biological interference with their normal, exquisite, rapidly changing development. And we learned that to our costs, 10,000 children born disabled and often without limbs. And worse, we learned that if the mother was unfortunate enough to take the first dose at day 20 after the egg was fertilized, the baby would be born with severe brain damage. If they took their first dose at day 22 after fertilization, they would have, I think, cardiovascular malformations, I think it was. If it was day 24, limb buds or limbs missing. So don't anyone tell me that without actually studying it, you know what this vaccine is going to do to the developing embryo. You don't. You've no idea, you reckless idiots. All of you physicians that are giving it to pregnant women, you are absolute reckless idiots. You need to be strung up by your thumbs and struck off. And any females who are thinking of having this vaccine, who might get pregnant around the same time or already pregnant, please don't take it. It might be fine, but you don't really want Mike even telling you it might be fine as the assurance. I'm very worried. I'm going to come on to this. So the emergency use authorization. Basically, these vaccines have not been through the normal approval process because, of course, they haven't been through the normal development process. They can't be assessed, even if we knew what the right things to do were, and we don't. We're guessing. They've only been through a partial clinical development. They had done about 1/3 of the phase 3 trial at the time. And people often lie and they say, oh, they've been approved. They haven't been. They've been looked at through what's called an interim analysis. They've looked at the results about 1/3 of the way through. So they've got almost no safety data about 2.5 months after administration. So we know pretty well what happens in a very narrow range of people about 2.5 months after taking it. So if something really bad happens 6 months after taking it, or in a slightly different group that's not being tested in the trial, we've got no idea. So it could happen, couldn't it? Well, let's just hope it's all right, because that's what they're doing. They're giving it to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people on the hope it'll be all right on the night basis. And I've just never been as ashamed as the industry I used to work in. If I had been in any of the companies making these, I would have protested and resigned anyway. I would have done. I know that because I resigned once from a company that was doing bad things and they wouldn't stop, so I just left. So, you know, any of you research scientists in there, you're not stupid. Why haven't you resigned? You're going to have to look yourself in the eyes through the rest of this year. And when we get into next year, you could have changed the course of history. Maybe you still can. If enough of you resign en masse, which you should, I think it would be a news story, don't you? Quit. Okay, emergency use authorization. There are just a few requirements. There must actually be an emergency. And there probably was something approaching an emergency in the spring of 2020, certainly in Europe, where I was living. And there certainly wasn't by the end of the year, nothing approaching an emergency. They were lying to us all the time about the number of people in hospital, but there was nothing much going on. So there wasn't really a public health emergency, but hey, let's just pass on that one. There must be no other ways to tackle this public health emergency that didn't really exist. For example, no treatments. Now, that's a complete lie. So if you look up the work of Dr. Peter McCulloch, you'll be able to find that there are 6 or 7 therapies that work: hydroxychloroquine, zinc, azithromycin, ivermectin, fluvoxamine, dexamethasone, budesonide, apixaban, and the list goes on as I fade off. It's the most treatable respiratory viral illness ever. So this idea that there are no treatments is an utter lie, right? So they approved an emergency 1/3 developed vaccine of a novel type, which toxicologists would probably have nightmares over, and they let you have it because there was an alleged public health emergency, which there really wasn't. And they said you have to have it because there are no treatments, which is a complete lie. Also, whatever you're doing, you have to bring forth a product with an acceptable risk-benefit profile. And we'll come on to that, but they definitely didn't meet that test either. They must commit through the regulator and the manufacturer to monitor and feedback on learnings. And they've definitely not done that either. You can go and check this in a minute. I'm going to tell you how you can check it. And if I'm wrong, call me a liar, but I'm not. And then the last one is complete informed consent with all the information that's available, with no coercion, a freedom to decline without there being penalties. That's pretty much do really. So fully informed consent. You're not feeling fully informed consent, are you? You're not, are you? Because you're not being given informed consent. You're not being told much about these things, and you're definitely not being given an option to refuse most of the time. And it's going to get worse. If you don't object, it eventually will come around and inject you, because it's not a public health emergency. This vaccine is being used to drive through something that we don't really understand, but it's definitely not what they say. and it's not benign. So I don't think these should ever have been rolled out, because I don't think there was an emergency. There were plenty of other treatments. The efficacy studies were dubious. They relied pretty much only on this polymerase chain reaction, or PCR reaction, and even the the CDC, earlier this week said it's pulling the test that it's approved itself through an emergency approval for about the last 15, 18 months. They're just pulling that test, and that's because they acknowledge it can't really do what they thought it was doing. You do know that those are the same kind of tests qualitatively. Those are the tests that they used to work out if the vaccines were working or not. So draw your own conclusions, won't you? I'm not sure we know whether they work. Don't take a strong position on it. I'm just saying that the tests they use are not reliable. So I'm not sure at all what those studies told us. But they're definitely not safe, and I'm going to come on to the data that tells us that. And finally, as they're not really needed, because if the emergency isn't a strong one and there are good medical treatments, why would you even bother with something like this? So those things have troubled me all the way along. I knew that there's something very badly wrong, because I knew the virus was not as lethal as they were telling you about, representing mainly a greatly elevated threat to the elderly and ill. But to people younger than 70 who were fit and well, it was a lower risk than influenza. Have you felt that in the last 18 months? Have you felt the world's media reflecting to you that this is a virus that represents a lesser threat to you of the working age population, a lesser threat to you than influenza? I don't think so. Something very strange has been going on, hasn't it? So in terms of safety, Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg of Germany and myself, 1st of December 2020, you can go and find our petition, Wodarg and Yeadon EMA petition, December 2020. Now, we were smeared all over the media, but all we said was, in essence, in our petition was what I've just said to you. These are new kinds of medicines. We're going very quickly, and we really urge the regulator to sort of slow down and do a sort of staged approval, because we were worried. We were worried they were just going to blaze away and give it to everybody, that was a good guess, wasn't it? And so we said, we're concerned about toxicity because these are completely new medicines and we haven't really seen adequate characterization. So we predicted just non-specific toxicity, which was worrying. And then specifically, we thought that, what else? I'm trying to remember the other two things. Never mind. Yeah, one of the things we were concerned about was a potential effect on fertility and pregnancy. And I'm going to come back to that one. I can't remember what the other one was. Never mind. Anyway, so now these have been rolled out and hundreds of millions of people have been given them. By the way, many people, for example, the elderly and ill, for whom these were meant to be the great saviour, you do know that those people weren't really included in the clinical trials. Most of the companies, and that's quite normal, they limited the number of people who were very sick, because you don't want deaths on your trial, and because you want a clean signal initially, and that's why trials take a long time. You first do the trial in, say, what we call healthy elderly, and then if that looks okay, maybe you'll add some people who are much older and really quite frail, and just see that it's still okay. And then they didn't do that. They just did the healthy elderly pretty much, and they blazed away at the old people's homes. Unsurprisingly, lots of people died shortly thereafter. They had no idea whether it would happen or not, and then they covered it up. But that's what happened. That's why we got this massive spike, a synchronized spike in the UK on rollout of the vaccines, and it occurred at the same dates everywhere. It can't occur the same dates everywhere if it's a naturally spreading virus, can it? Because it will take days to weeks to move around the country. It all spiked on the same day because they all started vaccinating on the same day. That's why it happened. So,
thank you.
What happened then? So, I shall roll to a close. So, I would say the two main kinds of side effects that we've seen. I mentioned earlier that the spike protein can cause platelet aggregation and trigger blood clotting. And unsurprisingly, we see thromboembolic events like cerebral vein sinus thrombosis, brain blood clots in women, myocarditis in young men, blindness, deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolisms and the like, and about 75% of the serious adverse events are of this kind, thromboembolic. And they're accompanied by deaths within days of vaccination that are running at, and listen to me please very carefully, the number of deaths are running at about 60 times the normal rate, which is very low. You normally get a few people who just accidentally die. It's just statistics. If you vaccinate millions of people, some people die, and you'll get some coincidences. In America, they expect between 100 and 200 people to have died within a few days of a vaccination. That's just like the statistical background rate mostly. They're now running at about 6,000. I'm not sure what the real number is, but it's thousands and thousands. So you can go and check that, VAERS. Go and check it. It's the public data. It's your record. If you don't look, there's nothing I can do for you. And then, but the final thing, I'll only just mention it briefly. The exact concerns Dr. Wodarg and I had regarding fertility, unfortunately, have seemed to have come to pass in that humans do raise antibodies against this placental protein, and we don't know what the significance is, but it's not good. So I'm going to roll to a standstill now.
Thank you very much, Mike. This was a very impressive talk.